It's good to see you all this morning. We appreciate you being here for this time of Bible study. We're actually beginning a new study today into the book of James. Last week we concluded our study in the book of Hebrews. And I suggest to you, well, we're right there, Hebrews, James, we'll go right on into James. But you know, there's actually more of a connection between the books than just that they are printed right beside each other, Hebrews, James. We know from our study in Hebrews, of course, that it was an intensive, extensive address to Hebrew Christians, Jewish Christians. And we talked all about that. Constantly we were talking about that through the book of Hebrews. But notice James chapter 1, verse 1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. Now, there's a possibility that might be a figurative expression, the 12 tribes, God's people, to God's people, all scattered. But I actually think, and most commentators think, that he's actually talking about the literal Jews, the Jewish Christians who were scattered abroad. We know, of course, that the Christians, the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were in fact scattered based upon the persecution. Well, first of all, they scattered when they initially learned the gospel because they were there in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, but they were from all places. They were there observing the Jewish feast day, and many of them would have left and gone home, thus scattering and taking the gospel message with them as they went. But we know, of course, when the persecution arose pretty quickly thereafter, it says in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, Saul was consenting unto the death of Stephen, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. So I don't know. I wonder. I don't imagine really that it's even coincidental. I imagine it's by design that the same terminology is used here. James to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. I think that's very likely intentional by the Holy Spirit. And for all those reasons, I would argue that there's sort of a connection between Hebrews and James. Hebrews certainly written to Jewish Christians. James probably too. And that's probably, again, emphasized by the fact that we think the book of James may be the oldest book in our New Testament, that potentially James was the first epistle that was actually written. It doesn't say, and you couldn't prove this necessarily, but almost all agree that it was written very early, possibly in the early to mid 40s, and it would make it the oldest of the written letters in our New Testament. It probably, again, most think, although it doesn't say, and therefore not necessarily provable, but most think it was written from Jerusalem. And so we think when he talks about the 12 tribes scattered abroad, he's probably talking about Jewish Christians, and he's addressing this epistle to them. As you know, I think by virtue of your many previous studies of this epistle likely, that it is an extremely practical book. It talks a lot about matters that would involve our daily living. And I've even heard some people refer to it as the gospel of common sense. And that's really good, because I think in our day and time we need common sense. It seems like that's lacking in a lot of places and with lots of people. And so it really is a practical epistle. We'll see that as we go through. You know, through the centuries, there's been some people who wanted to reject the book of James as an inspired book. You have no doubt heard the famous quote by Martin Luther, who said concerning James, he said, and it's kind of funny old way of saying things, he said it's a right strawy epistle. And by that he meant to contrast, well, the rest of the Bible is silver and gold. The rest of the Bible is precious things. James is like straw, not valuable. And so he wanted to reject James, and others have too. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they're wrong, but they see a conflict or a contradiction between what James said about works and what Paul, for instance, said in other places about justification by faith. I think they're wrong to try to suggest there's a contradiction. We'll work on that when we get especially to chapter 4. We'll work on that. But for those reasons, Martin Luther himself taught salvation by faith only. Well, James says it's not by faith only. Not chapter 4, chapter 2. In chapter 2 of James, he's going to talk about that. It's verse 24. You see then how that by works a man is justified, not by faith only. So you can imagine why Martin Luther said, I got a problem here. Because what James says directly contradicts what I believe about justification by faith only. I'm going to throw James out. Well, if we get to throw out the parts of the Bible we don't like, my imagination is we won't have a Bible left because everybody has something they want to throw out of almost every book. Tina?
But if he had really read Paul's writings, he would know that Paul didn't mean by faith only.
That's right. And we'll have to say a lot about that when we get to chapter 2 for sure. Who is this James guy? Any idea who this James fella is? Tom?
A lot of people think it's the brother of Christ.
Yeah.
And they look there. And if it's so, then it sort of ties into that writing of the 12 tribes, because I think in Galatians, where it talks about those that came up from Jerusalem to Antioch and, were there, or in Acts rather, and, that was Brother James, the apostle, had already been, martyred.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And then he had a lot of influence with the Jewish Christians.
I think you're right. There are four people in the New Testament by the name of James, and a couple of them are pretty quickly eliminated. One of them is the father of the apostle Judas, known as Thaddeus. If you look at Luke 6, verse 16, it names, in the King James Version, it's kind of confusing. Luke 6:16 names as one of the apostles Judas, the brother of James. But if you're reading the King James, you might notice that the brother there is italicized. And almost all other translations say that it's Judas, the son of James. And so the apostle Judas or Thaddeus, his father was James. We don't know anything else about that guy. And so he's just absolutely so obscure that there's no reason to think that he would have been the author of this epistle. Then there's James, the brother of John. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, right? He's one of the apostles. But as Tom was mentioning, he was early executed by Herod in Acts chapter 12, beginning verse 1. And so we think by the time the epistle would have been written, James the apostle would have been dead already. There was James the son of Alpheus, the third guy. So we got the father of Judas or Thaddeus. We don't know anything about him. We got James, the brother of John, who was early executed as a Christian. We've got James, the son of Alpheus, who was another apostle. But again, we don't know anything else about. Really, we know his name, and that's all we know about James, the son of Alpheus. But then there was James, the brother of Jesus. And technically, of course, we would say James, the half-brother of Jesus. Matthew 13, verse 55. Matthew 13, verse 55. Speaking of Jesus, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, James and Joses and Simon and Judas? So two of the brothers of Jesus, or half-brothers of Jesus, two of the other sons of Mary, were James and Jude. We think this is the James. And actually, if you look in Jude verse 1, in Jude verse 1, Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. So Jude identifies himself as James, or a brother of James rather, Jude and James, but they were two of the sons of Mary, half-brothers of Jesus. And so for all of those reasons, and of course the consensus of early church writers, which is not inspired of course, but they all point to James, the brother of Jesus, as being this James. We know, and Tom mentioned this too, we know that he was a prominent member, possibly an elder of the church in Jerusalem. In Galatians chapter 2, you remember Peter had been in Antioch of Syria, which was a Gentile church. But it says, in Galatians 2 verse 9, when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen. Verse 11, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. So a delegation of people was sent from Jerusalem to Antioch of Syria, and Peter, who was already there, played the hypocrite and separated himself from the Gentiles, because he was worried what these Jews sent by James might think of him for associating with those Gentiles. So that would definitely point out the influence or the prominence of James. That's not to say that James would have taught you should separate from the Gentiles. We're not suggesting that. We're just pointing out that those who came from Jerusalem were identified as having been sent by James, which would speak to sort of his prominence in the church at Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 15, you remember they came together in Jerusalem to discuss the matter of circumcising Gentile converts. It was big controversy. And so in Acts chapter 15, they went, Paul and others went up to Jerusalem to address that problem. So different ones spoke in that assembly. And in verse 13 it says, after they held their peace, James answered, saying, this is almost certainly the same James. And so he had a prominent role there in that meeting in Jerusalem, in which this controversy about Gentile circumcision was addressed. So he was a prominent, well, all of that, put all that together, he was a prominent, influential member of the church at Jerusalem, even quite possibly one of the initial elders of the church in Jerusalem.
Was there not James called? I can't recall what verse is there. James Alaius.
Yeah, and usually I think that's the expression given to James, the son of Alpheus, who was one of the apostles. Yeah. We don't know about his death. With this James, we don't know for sure about his death, but historians suggest, we don't have inspired information about how he might have died, but early church historians mention, Josephus, for instance, says that he was put to death in 62 or 63 by stoning. There's another historian, Eusebius, who said that, you remember there was a big conspiracy trying to kill Paul in Jerusalem there at the end of Acts, and that's what ended up with him being sent to Rome. Well, you know, a bunch of Jews had actually made a pact among themselves that they wouldn't eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Well, they didn't get that done because Paul escaped their conspiracy, and although he was unjustly confined for a long time and ended up in Rome, they didn't kill him. They intended to, and they didn't get the job done. But this Eusebius says that those who so desperately wanted to kill Paul turned on James then when Paul was gone and they couldn't accomplish their plan. They turned on James and they took him to a high point of the temple and threw him down. All this according to church history, not Bible, of course. The story is told, I don't know how in the world you'd confirm or deny it, but the story is told that he didn't die from the fall. He was obviously badly injured. He didn't die from the fall, and so they proceeded to beat him to death. Whatever you think of that, it suggests all of that. I think put all that together. This is a faithful man. Obviously, he drew the ire of these evil Jews who wanted to kill Paul, couldn't kill him. Maybe they turned on James. Again, all of that is what's suggested by history, not by any scripture reference to that. Again, we can't be positive, but we have a suggestion. It was written very early on in the early to mid 40s AD, possibly the earliest book written. It's just really practical. In a very general way, if you were going to summarize the book of James, you would say it was written to urge Christians to live what they proclaimed, to live the life that they profess to believe in. If you're going to say this, then do it, which is really a very necessary and practical thing for us, and it was for them. And so James is just that very practical book. Any thoughts and comments on any of that? Sarah?
He started out as an unbeliever. The brothers didn't believe in Jesus at all.
Exactly right.
So it's an amazing example of the power of the gospel.
Exactly right. I think Sarah makes a good point. Look in John chapter 7. In John chapter 7, you may remember it was time to go up to Jerusalem for a feast, and Jesus' brothers taunted him that he ought to go. If you think you're this special one, you ought to go to Jerusalem. Verse 5 says, "For neither did his brethren believe in him." So these brothers or half-brothers of Jesus didn't believe on him. But when you get to Acts chapter 1, in Acts chapter 1 at verse 14, remember the apostles had been told to stay in Jerusalem and wait for the coming of the Holy Spirit. But they weren't the only ones there. In Acts chapter 1 verse 14, these all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren. And so at this point, go from a point, as Sarah pointed out, not believing in Jesus, now they're believing. What would have made that change? Well, look in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul lists the people who saw the resurrected Savior, he goes through that list, verse 5, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. After that, he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen of me also, as one born out of due time. Now, the way verse 7 is constructed, you could interpret that to mean he was seen of James, who was one of the apostles. Then he was seen of all the apostles. Again, we got the issue of what James is under consideration there. But it could be taken to mean after that he was seen of James, his brother, and then he was seen of all the apostles again. He'd already appeared to him once. So I think that there's a pretty good chance that the James there of 1 Corinthians 15:7 is this guy, the brother of Jesus. What took the physical brothers of Jesus from unbelief to belief? There was something proved it to him, right? And I think what surely proved it to him was the resurrection. And James may in fact have been a personal witness of the resurrection of Jesus. All right, good thing to tie in there, I think. Really good. All right, anything else by way of introduction? All right. So again, the first verse introduces us to the author and the audience, and with several things that we try to tie in with that. If there's nothing else there on verse 1, let's read a couple more verses. Verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. The King James here uses the word divers. That seems kind of weird to us, divers temptations. But that is the old English form of our word diverse. So when you read that in the King James, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. The New American Standard Version there says, instead of diverse temptations, I think the New American Standard there says various trials. So count it joy when you fall into various trials. Count it joy? Are you kidding me? I would like for there to be no trials, no diverse temptations come out. I would just like to have it on easy street. No issues, no problems, don't have to deal with anything. But James says, I ought to actually be joyful about the fact that I face various trials. And then he goes on to explain that the reason why is that the trying of your faith worketh patience. So basically, he's suggesting, not suggesting, he's plainly saying that when our faith is put to test and we pass the test, when we're tried and we prevail, when we're tried and we persevere and see it through, it's not easy, but we stick with it. We keep on keeping on. That when we get to the end of that process, we're stronger than we were when we started. And a lot of times, we suggest that there's two possible outcomes. You're passing through a hard time in your life as a Christian. It can either destroy you or make you stronger. If you stick with it and see it through, you'll be stronger at the end. If you let it, it can destroy you. But if you stick with it and see it through to the end, you'll be stronger at the end than you were at the start. And for that reason, James says that's actually a thing that you can be grateful for. Be joyful over the fact that you face such trials and see it through. Tom?
Yeah, that harmonizes with a number of different other passages, both from Paul and Peter. And, when you look at Peter, those steps of, that build on each other. One of those was, faith and endurance and patience and different things. That builds on that. And then Paul, there writing to the Philippians, mentioned some of the same things as well. And then there are several places where Paul talks about count it all joy to be persecuted for Christ's sake and things like that. So here the writer James is going through and really he's harmonized. We talk about harmonizing the scriptures. It's really drawing the point in there. And then when we take a look at the book of Revelation, the whole book of Revelation is talking about those Christians endure till the end. And here he's tying that all in as well together.
All right. So again, the Hebrew writer says, no chastisement is pleasant in the moment. Remember when we studied that in chapter 12? He said, verse 11, chapter 12, verse 11, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness to them which are exercised thereby. And that's exactly the same idea that James has in mind here. Again, we wouldn't necessarily voluntarily choose, oh yeah, put it on me, man. What do you got? Give me your best shot, so to speak. We don't really look at it that way, but on the other hand, we can say, well, it's to my good. If I'm tried, if I have to work through trials, and I get stronger in the end, and then that's a good thing. It can be seen as a good thing. What if you had a kid, and you never let them deal with any trouble or issues? You never made them work. You just gave them everything. Let them lay up and eat chocolates all day long, and you just provide everything for them, and they don't have to do anything for themselves. What would you say about that? what would you say about that parenting model? You would say, that's ridiculous. They need to learn to work. They need to see things through. They need to be instilled with a work ethic, and they need to be given determination and drive. And those parents would be doing a terrible disservice to their child if they just gave them everything. We understand that, right? And that's really the concept here that James is talking about. Tom?
Come to, present day, with, a lot of the generation today, you go out and look at it. They don't know how to work. They've had everything given to them. They think everything should be given to them. And that doesn't encompass everybody, but a good portion of, this present generation has sort of been brought up that way.
Okay. Yeah.
And
it doesn't. It's not good. It's never a good thing. It's not good in the physical world. It's not good for us spiritually. So when we're tried and we endure, at the end of the process, we're stronger for it. And really, anything. This is the way we ought to see this. Anything that makes me a stronger Christian is a good thing, because I want to be a stronger Christian. And so if whatever I'm going through ends up making me stronger at the end, then I can be joyful about that. And that's exactly what James, and that's the word he uses. Count it all joy. Tom?
That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 5 as well. He talks about that. Perseverance and trials, such as knowing that tribulations bring about perseverance, and perseverance proven character, hope, and hope doesn't disappoint, because the love of God has been power within our hearts. So, it's a whole process that goes through. If you don't have that process, you never really grow and develop into the things that you should do.
Right. Timothy?
Yeah, I think what Mr. Thomas said is quite interesting. The book covers like three types of characteristics as it goes through. It covers trials, and then it goes into wisdom, and then it goes into wealth. And so, you start out with trials, but you persevere through that, like Mr. Thomas says, and then it'll end with the wisdom and the wealth based on that.
Okay. Yeah, good point. All right. Again, knowing this, that verse 3, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And so I think he's basically saying, let this process work out. It is a known benefit to endure trials. Let it work. Again, I think if we got to vote on things, we'd say, keep the trials away from me. But we know we can't. We're all going to face trials of, he uses the word diverse or various trials. We're all going to face various kinds of trials. Your trial may be a lot different than my trial and the next person's trial. We each have unique situations in our lives that we have to deal with. Whatever yours is, let it play out with a determination to be faithful no matter what. That's what we got to do. And when we do that, it's to our benefit. Wayne?
This concept here I think is an important one, because he talks about trials. The result of trials, not just having trials being brought upon you, but working through those trials produces endurance. And then as you have endurance, it gives you wisdom.
Yeah.
Because verse 5 starts out with the contrast. But if any of you lack wisdom, I think the perfect result, the perfect end of patience is wisdom.
Yeah.
Would you rather talk to somebody who has been through the same trial that you have, or somebody who's never experienced those trials?
Yeah.
I'd much rather talk to somebody who's been through those trials, worked through them. Why? Because they have the wisdom that they can impart for me to help me go through those same trials.
Yes, with the assumption that they were faithful to. Yeah, exactly right. Tom?
In a lot of industry and businesses and everything, we have what we call PM, or preventative maintenance. That comes from, these things that people went through this, things break down, need a certain amount of things. You got a car. If you ignore the things that go wrong with it, ignore little ticks and, low tires and different things, you're going to have problems. You're going to get out of a situation where it's really going to be bad. But if you pay attention to it and you correct the things as they come along and you keep the maintenance going, the car or the tractor or whatever it is continues to go through the, but then if, as you go along, when something does happen, you know how to take care of it and fix it, you know what parts to get and different things.
So you gain some wisdom.
So you gain the wisdom from it. So basically, it's a very practical application what James is presenting to us.
Yes. All right, so let's take that next step there that these guys have been mentioning in verse 5. Begin reading again at verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Okay, so in the course of these addressing these trials, maybe you feel like you don't have the wisdom that is necessary in the moment. You know, Wayne suggests that maybe I can talk to someone else who has been through similar things. And that's certainly part of God's plan. So if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, which would suggest I'm praying about this. I'm in the midst of this trial, and it's really tough, and I'm not sure which way to turn here. I don't know what to do. So if I'm in that dilemma, let him ask of God. God's answer to that may very well be to providentially bring about an interchange with someone who has experienced the same thing and dealt with it. That might be one avenue. That might be one of the ways that the Lord answers that prayer for wisdom, is to, as Wayne suggests, let me talk to somebody who's had the same problem and made it through. And that would be very valuable. Notice about God. God, in regards to asking God for wisdom, he gives that liberally and upbraideth not. He will give it to you. What's that expression, he upbraideth not? I'm reading King James. God giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. What, Monty?
New King James says without reproach. And I believe the idea there is sometimes we ask for things that we don't need. We just want them because of the various physical desire or whatnot. And God might not give us those things, because there's other places it talks about you ask for things but you don't get it because you're just going to consume it on your own lust. So that in effect would be God reproaching us for asking for it. But he says if you're asking for wisdom, God's not going to look down on you for asking wisdom. That's what Solomon asked for, and God commended him for that. And so that's something that we should ask for and desire, is wisdom to be able to know and how to understand to get through these various trials that we're going through in the proper way.
I think you're right. So I'm dealing with this trial, and maybe I've dealt with this before, and I haven't done real well, and I'm struggling here. I'm really struggling. And I asked God for wisdom, and God said, I told you before, I helped you before, you keep having the same issues over and over again, and I told you, you've addressed me in prayer about that a bunch, and I'm tired of hearing about it. Now that probably be possibly the way we would react to someone. God doesn't react that way. As Monty said, now sometimes God says no to our prayers about other things, but he's not going to say no to this prayer. If I'm praying for wisdom to deal with my trials, he's not going to come back and say, I've told you about that 100 times before. I'm not talking about that. He's not going to do that. He gives liberally and upbraideth not. No, it shall be given him. That's a positive affirmation. That's not a maybe it'll help. Pray to God and maybe it'll help. No, pray to God and it will be given him. Yancey?
We have to make sure we do our part. When we look at this verse, what is our part? We're to ask.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we kind of expect things to happen and we just kind of sit back and let things happen. But here we're to ask. If we like wisdom, we are to ask.
So I think the modern day word we would use, we got to be proactive here. Yeah, I think. John?
It said, as a student of the School of Hard Knocks, unfortunately, you learn real quickly that you can't just decide you want something. and then not do anything to make it happen.
Yeah.
And when you do fall, when you do fail to get there, if you haven't stopped to pay attention to what tripped you, you're going to trip again.
Yeah.
You're going to keep falling until you stop and pay attention.
And so you know, gaining wisdom requires us to put forth the effort to gain the wisdom. I think you're right. Okay. All right. I really think that's such a positive and encouraging statement there. If you're having issues and you need wisdom to deal with the issues, ask God, and it shall be given. But, he says, verse 6, ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. Let not that man think that he shall receive anything. Okay. I've read James 1 here, and I know it says pray about this, and so I will. But I want to tell you, I don't think it's going to help. There's no way. This is not going to turn out good. I'm going to pray about it, but I don't expect any positive outcome. That man is like a wave driven by the sea and tossed. Let him not think that he'll receive anything of the Lord. For a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. A guy like that, he's got big issues. He's unstable. This is probably just one manifestation of his instability. A double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. This guy's double-minded. He knows he's supposed to pray for God's wisdom in dealing with his various trials. He knows that, but on the other hand, he doesn't think it'll do any good. He's unstable. He's double-minded here. And this is probably just one example of his instability. It would cover all things in his life. Tom?
Comprehension of what double-minded means in that thing. You know, we do that a lot of times. We'll go through and do something, but you know, we let that. It's sort of that. You know, the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. You know, one telling you to do good, the other telling you to do bad. Which one you're going to listen to? A lot of times we turn and we do that with doubt. Sometimes we have the confidence that okay, it's going to work out, but other times we let that doubt work on us and override that positive aspect of it. I think who was can't remember the author that wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. You know, that was the whole concept of that book, and it's basically based on biblical principles. You have to believe in God and that thing, you know, do it in faith. A lot of times people just sort of faith and say, I believe God, but do they really believe God? They say they're going to do that, and then they do the things it needs to do to make that come into, you know, make it happen. It's not just, you know, I believe God's going to do that for me, and then sit back and wait for it. It's progressing through the things to get through to attain what it does and God's going to provide.
Okay. All right. So we got to believe that we got to believe that the process works, and we got to pursue the process. We got to have faith in the process. Rita?
Sometimes you're going through a trial and you kind of, wherever you are in your faith, that's fine. Your growth, you may lean the wrong way, but you still try.
Yeah.
If you don't try, you just keep leaning the wrong way.
If you don't try, it's definitely not going to work.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if you try, and you say you try and you don't have faith right now, don't give up.
Yeah.
I mean, God not accepted it yet, but you give up because you got to move the other way, and that it took you time to get left, it might take you some time to get right. You just keep going and going and going, and this is an encouraging passage, as you said earlier, because God doesn't say, I told you, you pray, you ask, He gives us time, and He's always there for us if we just keep going through it. Even if we mess up, just get back up, try again, until you get there.
Okay. So definitely the notion of perseverance through these trials. I think it's interesting that James opens up the epistle with this theme. You're going to go through some trials. So know that that if you make it through, it will make you stronger. It'll have a good outcome if you persevere and see it through. Now, if you need some wisdom in the course of persevering through that, pray for it. God will help you with that. And believe, by the way, that when you pray for wisdom, He'll give it to you, because if you don't have faith in that, there's really no use in asking for that. But keep on keeping on. I saw some of you guys, some of you kids are too young probably. You remember the basketball coach, Jimmy Valvano, Jimmy V. They recently had a special on about him. He died of cancer, and in the midst of his cancer, he was pretty close to death already with cancer. It was very far advanced. And he gave an address. He won an award that ESPN gave him, and he won an award. And he used the expression, "Never give up, never ever give up." And he's sort of famous for that sense of determination. But that really needs to be the expression that we use in regards to our spiritual life. Never give up, never ever give up. And as Rita suggested, if there's some setbacks, go at it again. We'd never give up. Tom?
Here he went up to Mount Carmel and he, performed a miracle there and basically defeated all the prophets of Baal and things. And Jezebel makes a threat against his life and he gets scared. And God had to remind him, no, there's still several thousand that haven't bowed their knees to Baal. Sometimes in our times of doubt, God still provides the encouragement if we'll turn around and look for it. And basically what Wayne had said there too, turn for that wisdom. Sometimes when we're really down, we need to find somebody that can, give us the encouragement to build us up to go on. Even we've had the faith.
And we're out of time, but so you've been through what I'm going through right now. And so you're trying to coach me about that. I got to be willing to receive that. I can't just say, oh, that'll never work. We got to be open to the wisdom that can be provided to us in these moments. All right, important stuff, important discussion. That sort of tells us, I hope even that initial initial paragraph really gives us a sense of just how practical James can be in our daily living. Lord willing, we'll continue our discussion there next week.